My name is Nick Sweeterman. I'm 38 years old. I grew up in a small rural farming community. Grew up with my mom and dad, my two sisters, in a Christian household. Growing up, I never really wanted for anything. My parents both worked hard to provide everything that my sisters and I needed. Went to grade school, went to high school. Throughout high school, I started, mostly because of peer pressure initially, but I started drinking. It seems like in the community that I grew up in, alcohol and alcohol use at a young age was socially accepted. With that, I, probably from my freshman year of high school, started drinking. And that went on all throughout high school. And it transitioned into college, and I went to Sinclair Community College in Dayton, where I studied computer information systems. I wanted to be like a help desk support person. And while I was at college, today I can look back at this and see it more clearly. But those, what I thought were innocent decisions that I started when I was a freshman in high school, drinking. By that time, even using drugs had turned into real life addictions. I was still, getting good grades in school. I still held down a job, but whenever I could, whenever I had free time, I was drinking, using drugs. That whole lifestyle had just engulfed my life. I think a lot of times I justified these actions by, well, all my friends are doing, or I'm in college and this is what college people do. But obviously today looking back, I can just see the progression of the addictions that were, developing in my life and beginning to take over my life. Managed to graduate college though. I actually graduated with honors. My goal after college was not only to get a decent job in the computer field, but I wanted to get to Columbus. My long-term girlfriend, Abby, had lived here. She went to Ohio State. So that was my goal. And within about 3 or 4 months after graduation, I moved here to Columbus, the end of 2007. And things just continued to kind of transition in that negative aspect, I guess you would say. I moved into a house with 7 other guys on the Ohio State campus. I was the only one living in that house that had a full-time job. The rest were all students at Ohio State. So that lifestyle that I had lived throughout my high school and college days just continued on, even though I was now working a full-time job. I lived in Columbus for probably about 3 or 4 months. Fast forward into the beginning of 2008, and probably some of my darkest times were during this period. Abby and I, who had been together for almost 6 years at that point, were kind of on the rocks, and mostly because of me and my decisions. And that not only played a part in my life, like overall life, but as far as my addictions and drinking and drugging, like it accelerated that to the fullest extent. And I was using more and drinking more than ever before. During that time, I had a job at a place called Microdyne. I was doing like entry-level computer work for them, and I just wasn't happy. It wasn't the job that I envisioned after graduating college. So I was looking, putting my name out there, and I actually, we'll fast forward to like March 14th of 2008, I had my second interview with the U.S. District Attorney's Office here in downtown Columbus. I interviewed, like I said, it was my second one with 3 older ladies for a computer support role. It would have been a pretty significant increase in pay for me, and just overall job quality was much better than where I was, and I was excited about it. I remember leaving there. I was going to head back home to my parents' house for the weekend where I had grown up to celebrate and hang out with some of my high school buddies. And I remember thinking on that way home, as I'm, drinking a 6-pack, like, well, if this job does, come to reality, if you do get this job and this opportunity, like, you're going to have to make some drastic changes in your life. And I had just glanced or thought about the idea, but I was definitely thinking about it, and drove home. Like I said, I'm drinking a 6-pack on my way home, meet up with my buddies for the night. We all pile in my buddy's Yukon, and we went out bar hopping for the night. The night was really no different than any other night I had throughout high school, college. We were drinking, using drugs, cocaine and marijuana that night. But on any other given night, it was, pretty much whatever was available.
As you're doing all of this stuff, what is your sense of God at this point?
Yeah, so during this time, I was born into a Christian home. My parents always instilled in us the importance of church, but they never really instilled in me the importance of a relationship with God. Being Catholic, it was, to me, more about, and to them as well, I think, more about the traditions and just being at Mass on Sunday than it ever was the relationship. So I did go to church throughout my youth, but once, even in high school, it was like hit or miss. But when I went off to college, and then especially when I was here in Columbus after graduation, my relationship with God was pretty non-existent. I called myself a Christian, but at the same time, looking back today, I was the farthest thing from it. I was, making choices that were destructive and sinful on a daily basis. I've always believed in God. I guess I will say that. There was never a point where I just didn't have the faith or believe, but I was pretty far from God during this time. And I think it was probably driven by the fact that I had shame and guilt for the decisions I was making. I was repeatedly, lying to those close to me, especially like Abby, about my drug use, about my drinking. When she would ask, I would get all defensive and say, no, I'm not using tonight, or no, I'm not doing this or that, when in all actuality, more times than not, I was, under the influence, and just had pushed him in a corner and out of my life for the most part. So I was headed back home. We met up, got my buddy's Yukon. We were out hitting the bars around the lake where I grew up, and it was, like I said, it was just a normal night. Had our fair share of drinks, and we were actually prepping for the next day. That was St. Patrick's Day, so we were all excited about that. We had a whole day full of events. Fast forward to the end of that night, it was about 2:30 in the morning. My buddy Al, who we were out with for the night, he dropped us all back off at our cars where we had met. Remember it like it was yesterday, getting out of that car and seeing my friend Kyle like stumble into his truck, and I'm like, Kyle, man, where are you going? He's like, I'm going home. And I was like, no, get in my car, man. I'll drive you home quick. Like, you're in no position to drive. And looking back, obviously, it was like I wasn't in a position either, but I guess at that point I thought that I was better off than him. And in the process of dropping Kyle off that night, I was involved in a fatal car crash. Ran the stop sign, T-boned another car, killing all 4 occupants of that car instantly, all 4 of which I knew personally. To say that, my life forever changed at that moment would be an understatement. To say that 5 families, including my own, forever changed at that moment would be an understatement. It was just, I think my body went into shock. Initially, I had myself or Kyle, who I was driving home, had no idea what had even happened. We were at the emergency room, and he was in one little bay of the emergency room, and I was in the other, and I could hear, him talking to somebody. And finally, when the 2 individuals that were talking to him came into my area, like sectioned off area, I said, what's going on? I thought it was a single car accident. I said, am I able to call my family and go home? And that's when the 2 guys, which, turned out to be detectives, told me, Mr. Sweeterman, you're not effing going anywhere. You've just killed 4 people. And just instantly my body was just numb, and they threw me to the ground, they handcuffed me, and threw me in the back of a cop car. The next probably 24 to 48 hours are pretty much a blur. Do remember coming to, and my family, my mom, my dad, my two sisters were actually sitting in the jail cell with me. Being in such a small rural community, jail at that time housed 20 individuals, so the sheriff actually let my family come in and sit with me and just, try to comfort me because I was, unconsolable at that point. It was a blur those first couple days. I'd like to think that I turned to God or had this, magical experience, but no, it was just a complete blur. I was on suicide watch, had some court proceedings that I don't really remember any of. I was in the county jail for the first time for like 30 or so days, and then my family actually bailed me out. Never forget the day I was I was out in the Sallyport area where they bring people in. That was actually the rec area for the jail. And the one deputy came out and he said, Mr. Sweeterman, you ready to go home? And I'm like, what? Mind you, my bail was $2 million at that time. And he said, he's like, your family bailed you out. You're good to go. And for me, that was such a big moment just because, more so today, even looking back at it, I didn't realize it at the time, but that period from pretty much April of 2008 till I went off to prison in November of 2008 just gave me time I was on house arrest. I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't do anything, but it didn't matter. I had my family there around me to support me, to, help me through a lot of dark moments and nights, and start to process, what had happened and how we were going to get through, whatever came next. Because at that point, I was facing 41 and a half years in prison. So we didn't know what the future held for myself or for them. The legal process obviously was new to all of us as well. So we were trying to figure that out. We had two attorneys, kind of guiding us through it, but it was still all like shock. It was still all new to us. I will say during that time, spending time with my family, with my, especially my mom and dad, because they were around a lot, and even my sisters, like we started to pray more. That's something like, aside from when I was maybe a small child, they came in at night and prayed with us before bed. We would sit in the living room and we would actually say the Divine Mercy Chaplet and prayer. And I don't know if it really at the time was just calling out to God, or we just felt like it was something we needed to do as a family. But looking back, for me, it was like I had never felt that close with my mom or my dad that I recalled in my whole life. It was setting the groundwork for me for what was to come, right? Because I had no idea, what lay ahead. I've never been to prison, what that all looked like, how many years, what that looked like. Fast forward to November of 2008, I was sentenced to 24 years in prison. My original out date was October 10th of 2032. And they shipped me off to CRC, and I was at CRC for probably about 30 days, and then I landed in Toledo Correctional. It was a high security facility. Throughout those, the CRC, and then when I initially got to Toledo, I continued the practices of the Divine Mercy Chaplet that my family had done together while I was out on bond, and just prayed to God every morning. I remember just sitting on my bed, whether that was at CRC or Toledo, and just praying to God, like, God, just give me the strength to get through, not even the day, just to get through from count time to count time, or to be able to handle whatever came my way that day. And I just said the same prayers usually every morning. I had a little booklet that I used to run through, and I would just say every prayer in that booklet. Because, being born and raised Catholic, it was all about repetitions, and I felt like I needed God at that point more than I had ever needed him in my life. That was the way I knew to reach out to him and to call upon him. CRC was dark because I was locked down 23 and a half hours a day, and a new experience. And I remember thinking one night standing out in the rain, they had us standing in like formation, like, God, if this is how the next 24 years is going to be, just take my life. Like, I don't have the strength to go through this. And thankfully, like I said, I got shipped to Toledo within about 30 days and got to Toledo. And that was a whole new, undertaking and an adjustment. Didn't know anything about Toledo besides the fact that it was a single man cell facility. It had air conditioning. And those to me were like two bonuses. So I was like, well, it's a good start, I guess. But when I got into the block and just, that first night of that door shutting and just feeling so alone, I remember just calling out to God, like, once again, like, just help me and whatever that I encounter. Like, looking back, like, he blessed me, I believe, by, keeping me safe and then putting me in a facility like Toledo initially, where I had my own cell, where I could lock the door at night and feel safe. I still was battling a lot of demons in my head initially, mostly the guilt and the shame from, what had happened in the accident and the lives that were lost. And I couldn't help but thinking, like, how many people that I had affected. And I actually remember, one night, it was probably within like the first month of being in Toledo, like, just calling out to God, like, God, I need a sign. I need something from you that will give me the strength to keep going. At that point, like, I had contemplated, just taking myself out. I had a plan. I had, a letter wrote to my family, and it was just like, I don't know. I didn't have really any desire or will to push forward. And sure enough, that next week, a guy, Mike, showed up in the block. And Mike, similar to myself, was born and raised Catholic, was from a good home. He was actually from Michigan, not Ohio. But make a long story short, he was at a Christmas party, New Year's Eve of 2007 going into 2008, got behind the wheel after a night of drinking and hit a family head on and killed the entire family. And he was actually sentenced to 43 years. But I share Mike's story in the fact that that was my prayer answered from God. He put Mike into my life, a guy that was just like myself, trying to figure out what the next steps were in his life, with the healing, with trying to deal with, what he had taken from this family, and then trying to maneuver through the prison system. And me and Mike quickly became really close friends, and we worked out together. We went to church together. We did everything together. And looking back, it was just like God showed up for me at that moment. Toledo had its, series of ups and downs. It was a high security facility. At the block I was in there with 48 guys. I had 24 years. I had the third shortest amount of time. So that gives you perspective on, the people that I was around and what they had done. And not to say that they were good or bad people, but, that's kind of the mindset with a lot of those individuals was they weren't trying to change. They were just there to do their time and do it in the best way they saw fit. And that was a learning experience for me to be able to learn how to maneuver through all different types of, mentalities, attitudes, the threats that come with prison. But God made a way and kept me safe throughout all that. Fast forward to about August of 2011, we were on lockdown for a riot. I was selling with Mike at the time because they had double bunked the facility by then. And we were on lockdown for a riot, and the case manager came to our door and said, hey, you both were chosen to go to Lorraine as cadres when we went through and scanned the blocks of guys that would even be potential candidates. Would you like to go? And I looked over the rack at Mike and I'm like, I'm out of here. I'm going. Like, this is once again, another blessing from God, like, to get me out of there. And so we both made a decision to go. And September 16th of 2011, we were transferred to Lorraine Correctional to be cadres. 5 or 6 people were actually killed at Toledo. Like it went from an okay, normal quote prison to pretty turned up and off the wall and just chaos every day. So I'm so thankful that, he allowed me to get out of that situation and go to Lorraine, where I pretty much spent the 3 years there busy working maintenance, learning a lot of new skills. All this time, Toledo and in Lorraine, I attended Catholic services. Like I was going to church out of, like, I felt like it was an obligation. Like you have to go to church every Sunday because, I believed in God. I knew he was working in my life, but that relationship piece was still not there. Like I was calling out to him, but it was more like in a routine, form letter style prayer where there was nothing personal about it. But I continued. And even towards the end of my time in Lorraine, which would have been like in the beginning of 2014, I did start attending the Protestant services in addition to the Catholic services, just to kind of see what else, might be out there. So my interest was kind of intrigued at that point in something different than the Catholic faith. But I never fully jumped over. And then in August 12th of 2014, I got the opportunity to be transferred over to Grafton Correctional. Looking back on the whole situation, my time at Grafton was finally a place where Lorraine was kind of like that as well, where I could take a deep breath, I could work on myself, I could get involved. There was a lot of programming at Grafton, so I was able to sign up for a lot of the different programming, whether it was recovery or something to do with addiction or just whatever. They had their variety of programs that I could get involved in. Just tried to really dig into myself and deal with the guilt, the shame that I was still dealing with, work on healing and walking through that whole process, with my accident. And there was a lot of programs that played into that overall, but the biggest one I would say would have been the WAGs for Kids organization. I started training service dogs a few months after I got to Grafton. And for me, it was the first outlet that I had where I was able to finally give back a little bit. I was able to, when I saw that first kid receive his dog in the visiting room, it was like something clicked in me. And from that point forward, I dove into that program. I put as much time as I possibly could into it because I felt like, once again, it was another blessing that God had opened the door up for me to be able to join and then get involved and then take the interest in it like I did. And it was a win-win. It helped me to pass my time, and it also helped me to be able to start to give back. But it was probably around 2015, maybe 2016. New Point Community Church started coming to Grafton, and John Covender brought in the message every week on Saturdays. But for me, that was a turning point in my faith journey, because it was the first time I remember in my life where I was actually excited to go to church. I was excited for Saturday mornings at 9 o'clock to be able to walk over to the chapel and hear the previous week's message that the pastor there had given to the congregation. It was not the first time, but the first time I had ever really thought about that relationship piece with the Lord, and just kind of put all the formalities and the routine prayers that I had from my Catholic journey aside and said, I'm just going to talk to God like I talk to anybody. I'm just like I'd talk to my best friend. I'm going to talk to God like that. And for me, that's when I feel like my whole life just started to slowly change. Obviously it was a work in progress, but the healing came a little faster. Just the way that, I felt like God was speaking to me to, get involved in this, or to reach out to this person that I had, not talked to in a while, and just listening to him and letting him guide my life. Obviously, a lot of this is hindsight. I didn't see a lot of these things at the time, but today it's crystal clear how he was just orchestrating behind the scenes from, really my whole life, obviously, but especially from the time my accident happened till, all the way through. About September of 2022, I had filed for judicial release 2 times prior to September of 22. Both times the courts turned me down pretty quickly, which was normal. I mean, a guy like myself serving a 24-year sentence, I filed the first time right when I had 12 years in. They denied me, and then I think I waited 10 months and filed again, something like that, and they denied me. But this third time, come September of 2022, my lawyers at the time, they said, Nick, we just think this time's going to be different. I remember when I got the call, or I called home one night, and my sister told me that they had to actually put it into the system to transport me back to Mercer County for a judicial release hearing. I remember going back to my cell and being so overwhelmed with just joy and happiness that not that anything was guaranteed at that point, but at least I was going to get my shot to be in front of the judge, to explain how I felt, to just, obviously express my sorrow and guilt for what had happened, but to more importantly share that, I was no longer that man, that I had changed my life, and that I hope that to get this next opportunity to be able to share my story, help others, do what I'm doing here today. So I was transferred back the end of September of 2022. Spent about 3 weeks in the county. During that time, you would think it would have been like a joyous experience. You think it would have been like I would have been happy every day, because more than likely I was about to start the next journey in my life as a free man, but I was very overwhelmed. I was very full of anxiety, and I remember sitting there every night wow, God, what's next? Just like I did in the very beginning, and I did throughout my whole time in, but prayed to God every day, just give me the strength to get through this day, whatever it may bring. Being back in the county, which was now a new facility, much larger, it just brought back so many old memories from my original time there. But during that time, I actually sat down with my victims' families. It was something that I had longed for. I had wanted for so long. So I felt wow, God, here's another prayer answered. You just keep putting blessings in my life. And, when I got to that day and that night, I remember just feeling just so overwhelmed, because he had answered my prayer, and now I had to step up to the plate. And I met with my lawyer for about an hour before the meeting was set to begin. And I remember sitting in that room, just sobbing, how am I ever going to get through this? How am I ever going to look these families in the eye and tell them how sorry I am, tell them, I wish I could undo, I wish I could redo. And although I know none of those things were possible, I was just so overwhelmed. And the time came, my lawyer looked at me, said, Nick, you ready? And I said, yeah. He walked me down the hallway, and remember we came around the corner, they were all sitting in this conference room, and I could see them all in there. And we walked in, the prosecutor and the head of the jail, they were all there, the sheriff. They had 2 chairs for my lawyer and I up front, in front of the families. And I told my lawyer, I said, no, you can go sit in the back. And I sat up in front of them and spent about 2 hours just pouring my heart out to them, and letting them, more importantly, let them vent to me and share with me how they were feeling, and, what my actions had done and taken from them. And overall, I feel like the meeting went pretty well, and God gave me the strength to sit up in front of them and to hold my head high and to express myself in the way that I wanted to express myself. And I left that meeting, and I was just so overwhelmed with I literally felt like the Lord, the presence of the Lord was so strong at that moment that it's even hard to explain. In that moment, the meeting, none of that wasn't meant for me. That meeting was meant for those families. But for me, it was so freeing to be able to just sit and talk with them. I made a promise to them that I would spend every day moving forward bringing good to this in some fashion.
How did they respond to you?
So to me, overall, they were pretty supportive, I guess. I would say they did have some choice words in the beginning that I feel like they just needed to get off their chest. I think they knew in their hearts that this was happening, and they had to accept that, I was coming out. Their main goal or wish was that they didn't see me on a regular basis. Growing up in the small rural community that I did, you can't help but run into each other if I was back in that area. That's actually one of the stipulations of my release, is I'm not physically allowed in that area while I'm on probation. When I shared with them that I was going to do everything moving forward to bring light to this, they encouraged me, and they said, we hope you do. For them, they had saw what I had done in prison. They had saw all the certificates. They had saw the dogs that I had worked with. They had saw the great resume that I put together while I was in there. But I think, myself sitting in front of them and having an open conversation and sharing how I felt and being vulnerable, I think they needed that to see that it wasn't all just some hoax by me to be able to get out. I believe that at that time they thought my words and emotions and feelings were all genuine. And I hope that gave them comfort. So that was on a Monday. And then that following Thursday, it was October 11th of 2022, I was released. It still blows me away to think about it. Like that morning waking up and thinking like, not that this is over with, but this chapter of my story is over with. And walking out, my lawyer was there that day. He walked me out, and my family were all sitting there waiting for me. And it was just like, after almost 15 years of sitting behind those walls, it was just like, it didn't even feel real at first. I would say for the first week or so, it was just like, is this real? Like, are they coming back to get me? Is this like... It just honestly didn't seem real. Not only getting out after serving almost 15 years, but getting out one day shy of 10 years early. The blessing that is in itself is just, it's hard to explain. Since that day, God has worked in my life. I've had my family around me to love and support me. And whether it was with my living situation, my financial situation, my job situation, they've helped me walk through all those processes. It's really overwhelming. Not only from the beginning, from the time my accident happened, but especially since my release, how the Lord just continues to provide. Today, I feel like my relationship with Him is stronger than ever. When I first got out, I was going to a Catholic church close to where I was living with my sister and brother-in-law. And once again, I felt like I was just going because I knew I had to go to church. I knew like that's the least I could do with all the blessings that the Lord had put in my life. The thought of exploring something else never had really come to my mind. I did have, through New Point, I did have a different take on my faith, and that relationship piece was there, and I was praying to God. But as far as a church, when I got out, it was like, yeah, I'm going to check out the Catholic Church because it was what I knew. It was what I felt comfortable doing, especially initially. But it wasn't long, a few weeks, I was going to this church, and I remember leaving one Sunday, and I was thinking like, Nick, what are you doing? Like this doesn't feel right, doesn't seem right. I don't know. It didn't feel like home to me. I came home. I was talking to my sister about it. She's like, well, why don't you go check out Rock City? It's down in the short north. And I'm like, yeah, I might do that. And then I think a week passed. I didn't do it. And then she's like, you want me to go with you? So her and I went down there, and we went to a service. And from that point forward, it was like I was hooked. Whether it was the worship music, the people, everybody was so welcoming to me. And more importantly, I think for me, it was everybody was so excited to be at church. And I had never seen that before. Going to the Catholic services or Mass, like it seems like typically, not always, you walk in and everybody's just, they're there and sometimes they're smiling, but they weren't filled with the joy that the people at Rock City were. And from that point forward, I've dove into the church. I got to know a lot of people. I signed up for a small group initially and was going to Matt and Julie's house, and they were just so welcoming. Even after they heard my story, and I met so many, men of faith throughout that group, that it just continued to branch. Now, today I'm a meal night coordinator at the Dream Center, which is a nonprofit that is tied to our church, that the Rock City actually started here in 2015. We feed the homeless Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday nights, but I'm a Tuesday night coordinator. And for me, going down there and serving that population is just so rewarding. I'm there to be the hands and feet of Jesus, but I feel like I get just as blessed every night that I go down there by, the stories I hear, the people that I am able to pray over, or just feed them a hot meal, just to be able to serve them. I've never been homeless, but I feel like I can relate to them much more than even any of the other volunteers, just because they're struggling. They're struggling right now, and I know what that's like. We all know what that's like to struggle, right? But I feel like once I share my story and open up with them, their guard comes down and they open up to me about what they're dealing with. And that's just been such a huge blessing. And just, there's been a lot of other opportunities that have come through the church. I was able to go out to LA and serve at the Dream Center out there for a week, and just meet a lot of men of faith and women of faith, and just, believers like myself that are on this journey with the Lord. With each new story or with each new event, it just continues to solidify for me that faith and my relationship with the Lord. And truly today, it is at the absolute most important aspect of my life. I still have my days where I struggle with my past, or I struggle with what happened. But I know at the end of that day, or at that given moment, I can, call out to the Lord, and He might not always take that pain from me right away, or that shame, or whatever it is I'm dealing with that day. But more times than not, He'll redirect my attention to something else. He'll give me the comfort or the peace that I need to get through it, or the strength to get through it. And just very grateful for that.
So we know through Christ, we can be forgiven for anything. Have you forgiven yourself? And if you have, what was that process like?
Yeah, so the process of self-forgiveness for me has taken me a while. Although I know from day one the Lord has forgiven me, when I confessed that my sin to Him, He forgave me instantly. It's taken me a while, and sometimes today I feel like I struggle with it, because for me it's not like a decision. It's a one and done. I just forgive myself and move on. For me, it's making that conscious decision each and every day. Nick, you are forgiven for what you've done. You have to forgive yourself. You have to, and those emotions and feelings, they come up a lot less frequent than what they did initially, and they have throughout the years, but they still do come up from time to time. And I just remind myself that the Lord has forgiven me. And when those feelings of guilt and shame and, just for feeling terrible for what I've done come up, I can quickly shut them down and say, you are forgiven, and forgive myself. But it's been a process. And there's been times where I feel like I've made a lot of progress, and then I'll have a day where it'll bring me back. But thankfully, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, it's very rare for me to have, days where it comes up to the point where I'm questioning this or that, because ultimately I know that the Lord has forgiven me for what I've done. He's washed away that sin, and who am I not to forgive myself when He's forgiven me? So,
what advice would you give someone who is struggling with alcohol, drugs, or any other type of addiction?
Yeah, so people that are struggling with, whether it's alcoholism or any kind of addiction for that matter, the biggest thing that I would stress to them is you have to make a choice. When we're in our addictions and we're, dealing with alcoholism, we make a choice to drink, right? So if you want something to be different, you have to make that choice to say, hey, I want something different in my life. Obviously, then there's more to it, right? For me, it was making the choice to, hand my addictions over to God and allowing God to take the reins of it. For some, maybe they need to lean into meetings and resources like that. But I would just suggest to anybody that's, right now living in a state of addiction, to just make the choice. I know it sounds simple, but once you make that first choice and taking it day by day, it gets easier over time. This past March, it was 16 years that I've been totally clean and sober. And I'll admit those first couple years were difficult, but it was one choice after another. Like, hey, tonight I'm going to stay clean. And then I'd wake up in the morning and reset and pray to God to give me the strength to get through that day, and not just physically get through it, but get through it, as far as my addictions. And I guess the last part of that question that I would just say is don't wait, because the longer you wait, the more compounded those addictions get, the more intertwined in bad relationships you'll get, the more just chaos or consequences that'll come your way. My life today is much different than I ever thought it would look, being totally clean and sober, but it's an absolute blessing to be able to wake up each and every day and be free from those addictions and not have them have me weighed down and just feeling overwhelmed with the guilt and the shame that comes from addiction and alcoholism and stuff like that. So
Finally, you mentioned throughout your testimony that you were a slave to sin through drugs and alcohol. In essence, you were a prisoner of the devil. Now that you have a brand new life in Jesus, what does being a prisoner for Christ mean to you?
When I was a slave to sin, kind of like I just shared with the addiction, I was constantly, weighed down. I was constricted by the weight of that sin, by the guilt of that sin. Even on some of my best days, felt weighted down because I knew in the back of my head that what I was doing was wrong, that, I needed to make a change in my life. On the contrary, being a slave to the Lord and being the slave to Jesus, to me, means I've totally given my life to Christ. And with that, not that I'm constricted physically, because I'm freer today than I ever have before, but with that, I live by a set of principles. I live by His word in the Bible, and I let that guide my life. Right? When we're a slave to sin, we're guided by our addictions and those choices. When we're a slave to Jesus and we've given our life to Jesus, we let Him dictate our lives. We, pray about situations and just let Him guide us in our everyday, movements and actions. And when one can get to that point in their life and just give it totally to the Lord and say, Lord, you have my life. Use it how you see fit. It seems far-fetched for some. It seemed far-fetched for me not only a few short years ago, but since doing so, I've seen the Lord just work in my life in unimaginable ways. Looking back, how He just continues to provide and just work in my life.
Nick, could you pray for those who have seen this testimony and are under conviction and want to give their life to Jesus?
Yes. Lord, I just thank you for this time, Lord. I thank you for the opportunity to share some of my testimony and story with those listening. And Lord, I ask that you will just work in their lives as you have mine, that you will just give them the strength, the wisdom, the knowledge to be able to make that decision, to take that next step, and just to lean into you, Lord, to know that they can't do this alone, that only with you and through you, they can break through these addictions and break through these challenging times in their life. And I ask these things, Lord, and I ask that you will bless all those listening, even those that aren't struggling with addiction, Lord. Bless them, work in their lives, and just allow them to feel your presence day in and day out. We ask all these things in the name of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.